In lesson 5 for part 2, we're actually not going to be learning anything new. I'm just going to kind of sum up the chapter so far before we go into our last lesson of the chapter, because you need to know how to graph linear equations and write equations before you can do anything from the last lesson, from parallel and perpendicular lines. So once I finish going through this, just hit pause and copy it down into your notes. And you can use this to kind of help you study and also make sure you're clear on all 4 of these. When we're talking about, when we're talking about graphing linear equations, there are 4 different ways that you can graph them. First way is what we learned in chapter 4 and what you used a lot last year, t-chart. And it's with your x values. So x is your independent variable, y is your dependent variable. It depends on what you plug in for x. Plug in at least 3 x values to find the y's. Then we went into slope-intercept form. Y equals mx plus b. M was your slope, b is your y-intercept. You always started the y-intercept, which is the y-axis. I've noticed a lot of you accidentally going to the x-axis sometimes there. Count your slope out to find more points. Remember, if it's a positive slope, up and right. Negative slope, down and right. Standard form is the third way we talked about, and that's intercepts. This one is only your y-intercept. This on here, you're finding both intercepts, x and y-intercept. When you plug in 0 for x, you're going to find your y-intercept. When you plug in 0 for y, you're going to find your x-intercept. Its standard form is when x and y are on the same side of your equation. You're using a t-chart, but remember it's different than this t-chart because you're plugging in 0 for y, finding x, 0 for x, finding y. And then the last way we talked about was point-slope form. And remember, you can always take point-slope form if you forget how to do this and convert it to slope-intercept form. And then you've learned how to convert slope-intercept to standard. So you should be able to go through these 3 back and forth fairly easy. It's hard to get to point-slope form, but it's easy to get point-slope form to one of these. And then these you should be able to convert back and forth between all the time. So just remember x1 and y1, and that it's always the opposite sign because this was a negative. So if you have a negative there, you know you're pulling out a positive of those. And if you have a positive, you know you're pulling out a negative of them. That's what I put down here. So you pull the given x1 and y1 out to start at a point. Make sure you have the opposite signs of what they are. Then you count out your slope from that point to add more. Makes it very similar to this one. The only difference is here you're starting at your y-intercept and counting out your slope. Here you're starting at a point and counting out your slope. Here you're only finding the x-intercept and the y-intercept where it crosses on the axis. Here, random points. So go ahead, hit pause, copy that down, and when you're done I have one more I'm going to go through with you. So this is the second thing that we mainly have focused on so far is writing linear equations. And there are 2 ways that you can write a linear equation. You can write one using slope-intercept form, or you can write one using point-slope form. And there are 2 different types that they give you. They give you 1 point and slope, or they give you 2 points. You can write any equation using either of these, whatever is better for you. And then remember, we're going to go over after this how we can convert from point-slope to slope-intercept, and then from slope-intercept to standard form, and then from standard form back to slope-intercept form. So you should be able to convert your equations around to the different forms also. But just remember when you're given 1 point and slope versus 2 points, only thing added when you're given 2 points is that you find your slope. Once you have m, you're right back to here, 1 point and slope, because you're just going to choose one of your 2 points. So when you're looking at slope-intercept form, you have m, you have b, and you have xy. B is going to be your missing value. You'll have an x, you'll have a y, you'll have an m. Use your m, your x, your y, and solve for b. Once you have b, you rewrite the equation with x and y as variables, so you should only be plugging in your m and your b. Point-slope form, 2 points, you need to find a slope. Once you have slope, back to the same idea as over here, pick one of your points and your slope, and then you're just going to plug them into the given formula that you've memorized right here. And you plug in x1 and y1, so you'd be plugging in here, here, and then your m. Y and x would still be variables there. Watch your signs. Go ahead and hit pause, copy that down. Once you're done, hit play one more time. The last thing we're going to talk about is just converting between the equations. So if you're starting at point-slope form, you can always convert to slope-intercept form. And I showed an example over here. You would distribute your 2/3 and then isolate y. And once you isolate y, you have y equals mx plus b form. Then from slope-intercept form, you can always convert to standard form. And you learned how to do that in some of your notes if you need to go back and look again, but quick review. You use fraction busters if you need it, because you don't want fractions or decimals in standard form. And then you move x and y to the same side. There's my x. Notice I kept my negative with it. And then equals my c. And then, of course, you can always go from standard form to slope-intercept. These two you can go back and forth between, and you would just isolate y if you were trying to get this into slope-intercept form. So I just wanted you to remember that you can kind of convert between those. After we do a little more review on all that, we'll move on to lesson 5.5.